Copley was a man, I'll say at the outset, of weak belief in an age that demanded strong belief. And I hope that that sort of poor match with his times is something that we could come back to in question and answer. It's something that I've been thinking about a lot since this book came out last fall, and our own age is an age that seems both to produce and demand heated and strong belief. And I've been thinking about what a man of sort of cool temperament, as Copley was, would make of it. So my talk this afternoon proceeds in the form of a circle, which is a self-conscious way to tell a story about a revolution. After the American Revolution, and especially after the French Revolution, about a generation later, the word revolution took on a new meaning, the meaning that we still hold to today, which is neatly captured in this quote from Hannah Arendt, the great philosopher of revolution. Revolutions confront us directly and inevitably with the problem of beginning. And she goes on to stress this idea of a rupture followed by the creation of an entirely new society, the beginning of a complete change of society. Arendt's sense of revolution echoed the words of Thomas Jefferson upon his election to the presidency to the first time in 1800, when he said in a letter, "We can no longer say that there is nothing new under the sun, for this whole chapter in the history of man is new." That the American project had upended even Ecclesiastes. So my talk is a circle beginning and ending with this picture because John Singleton Copley, like many people of his generation on both sides of the Atlantic, clung to an older sense of what revolution meant, a circular sense based in Enlightenment science and centered on revolving, not always staying the same, but a putting right within more or less a fixed orbit. When people talked about the glorious revolution of 1688, that's what they meant, a righting of the path rather than a new beginning. Copley embraced a certain degree of innovation, especially in his art, but not wholesale reinvention. Though he didn't quite put it this way, he believed in evolution, not revolution. This is Copley's grand picture of his family, which was painted during the Revolutionary year 1776. It was on his easel that spring. A diarist noted seeing it in Copley's painting rooms on April 1st, still unfinished, with the likenesses just beginning to be clear, which means it takes only a little bit of poetic license to imagine that it was still there on the 4th of July. This was the largest and most complex picture Copley had ever painted, about 10 times the size of many of his bust-length portraits. And it contained, in many ways, his whole emotional world. That's his beloved wife, Sukie, there in a kind of Madonna-like blue costume, his stern-faced father-in-law, Richard Clarke, who you'll see made everything about this picture and about Copley's life at that point both possible and inevitable. And there's the artist himself in the background at the upper right of the painting, sort of directing the scene. He has a set of plans in his hands. And then there are 4 children depicted in the playful, gambling fashion of the day, though by the time the painting was produced, one of them was dead, never known by his father and buried an ocean away. The setting that we can glimpse through the aperture in the back of the painting is vaguely Italianate. It recalls the setting of his painting, The Ascension, which he completed the year before, a small sort of 2x3 study for an altarpiece that he had created in Rome, in dialogue with pictures he was seeing by Poussin and especially by Raphael, something he talked a lot about in his letters. But if the setting behind the painting is Italian, The setting in which the painting was painted was London. Copley's easel in the spring of 1776 was set up in elegant rented quarters at 12 Leicester Square, just around the corner from the studio of Sir Joshua Reynolds and near the British Museum. All spring long that year, people came in and out of the painter's home talking about the great subject of the day, the American War. Some were for it and some were against. So the diarist I mentioned, who saw the family portrait on the easel, carried with him that day a new pamphlet entitled An Inquiry into Whether the Guilt of the Present Civil War in America Ought to be Imputed to Great Britain or America. The author's answer was America. A few days later, Copley picked up Richard Price's observations on the nature of civil liberty and the justice and policy of the war with America, which that author thought was unjust. Here's how Copley described the war with America when he first learned about the fighting of Lexington and Concord. The fighting, of course, in April of 1775. Copley learned about it in July, 3 months after shots were fired in Parma, Italy, which is where he was then on his grand tour. So he calls it a civil war. The Civil War is now broke out in America, and I have not the least doubt it will rage with a violence equal to what it has ever done in any other country at any time. So a civil war is in many ways the opposite of a revolution. It's a kind of spasmodic violence with unpredictable consequences. I think when we talk about civil war, we tend to think of things that are not progressive, that are retrogressive, that take us back to a stage of barbarism that need healing, not a new beginning. And yet, civil war was the species of war to which revolution belonged in Copley's imagination. At the same time that his Boston countrymen were actively calling a new nation into being in a declaration centered on words like dissolve and assume and publish and declare and pledge, Copley in Italy was reveling in a kind of happy happenstance, thinking of himself not as an agent of destiny, but as a receiver of it, not as a declarer of independence, but as a creature of interdependence, a sort of mesh of calling and character and family that had taken him from the edge of the British Empire in Boston at last to its center. So what I want to do for the next half hour or so this afternoon is to look at the American Revolution through Copley's eyes. This is a detail from his 1769 self-portrait. And think about how the American War, as he calls it, emerges when we see it from his perspective. A man of weak belief, as I said, looking west from London rather than from Concord or New York or the Carolinas or any of the more familiar settings of the American Revolution. So I want to talk mostly about Copley, but I also want to think with you about how his perspective changes our understanding of the story. And I'll start, as we often do when talking about the American Revolution, in my hometown of Boston. So Boston began calling itself the cradle of American liberty as early as the 1790s. And by the time of the United States centennial in 1876, this slogan was everything but trademarked. Part of not only the city's sense of itself, but of a burgeoning tourist economy, including the new Museum of Fine Arts, which opened in 1876 on July 4th, facing an open plaza that came some years later to be called Copley Square. Beginning in that generation of the centennial, Copley's work came to play a large role in a civic and national story. We could say that Copley's Paul Revere, which you see here, was the baby in Boston's cradle of liberty. So this is Copley's most iconic work. I think probably the second most famous face in revolutionary America, following only George Washington's. Copley never painted Washington, which I think is a loss on both sides. Copley painted this portrait of the silversmith Paul Revere in 1768, a year of renewed political upheaval in Britain's American provinces, following a period of relative quiet in the wake of the repeal of the Stamp Act 2 years earlier. It's a small painting. If you've ever seen it, it's about 2 feet wide by 3 feet high, but it looms large in our national mythologies as an emblem of a kind of American plainness and directness, the value of honest work, and the role of the individual in forging the republic. In a story of ourselves as a nation of faces and a nation of makers, Paul Revere looms large. I think it's a kind of New England-centered nationalism that Revere calls into mind for us. The painting was owned by the Revere family for over a century and a half and came into public hands in the 1930s, as many works of art did when people were so hard up for money in the Great Depression. And here is how the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston displayed it in 1951, where you can see that it's an almost sacred object. So this is the central rotunda of the museum, if you know that museum, and it has the classical pillars behind it, and it's on this little makeshift, really an altar, I can say with confidence as a lapsed Catholic girl. That's Revere's Liberty Bowl, made about the same time as the portrait, in front of him in a sort of chalice-like fashion, with the flag of the United States on one side and the flag of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts on the other, in case you missed the purpose of this work. So, of course, a lot about American museology has changed since 1951. But even today, in the spectacular new Art of the Americas wing at the MFA, a trace of that altar-like presentation remains, with Revere as a kind of high priest of revolution and his famous Liberty Bowl before him. And along the wall, receding to the left there, you see a quartet of other Copley sitters. From the front, Sam Adams, John Hancock, Dr. Joseph Warren, and Mercy Otis Warren. These are pictures that Copley painted at various moments and for various reasons during the 1760s at the height of the artist's Boston career. And here, hung together as they were never meant to do, right? These are all private works in private homes. But here they become a kind of patriot pantheon, as my friend and colleague Jill Lepore has called them, the Revolutionary Super Friends. The gallery is called Revolutionary Boston, which is not wrong, but it's not exactly right either, because none of these figures was portrayed in the middle of fomenting a revolution. They were citizens in private life, organizing in various ways around taxes that they didn't like in the 1760s, none of which was commemorated in the portrait. When I teach these works, I talk about that portrait of Hancock, second from the back there, or second from the front, and remind my students that, when he's portrayed with his account book in 1765, honoring the fact that his rich uncle has just died childless and all the money has come down to him, he's not practicing his signature in that account book to use it at the bottom of the Declaration of Independence 11 years later, right? That's not how time works, although because we look backwards, we often think that way. So Copley was not born in the future United States, but on the western edge of Britain's empire. The orientation of this 1769 map, like many seaport maps of the period, faces east, right? It's the whole city, like the map itself, performs for the sea. And that long arm jutting out there is Boston's Long Wharf. It was along one of those tiny little houses. I think I have it still closer here. One of those tiny little houses on the north side of the wharf that Copley spent his earliest years. He was the child of immigrants, which is relatively unusual in 18th century New England. His parents were from Ireland, part of the second wave of Irish immigration to Boston in the 1730s. His father was a ne'er-do-well from Limerick, and his mother was a fallen gentrywoman from County Clare. This could be a Jane Austen novel. What this oceanic setting means is that the idea of America had very different components and linkages in Copley's American life than the later United States did. So, for example, for this world of ships in Boston Harbor, places like Nova Scotia and Barbados and Jamaica and London were in every way closer than New York or Philadelphia. Closer almost literally because the seas were highways and the roads were barely more than footpaths. So when Copley and his fellow Bostonians thought about the America they belonged to, it was not continental. It was a place with closer ties to the Caribbean, to Ireland, to the west coast of Africa, and especially to New England, than to any kind of continental strip. There was no 13-ness about the 26 British colonies, 26 British American colonies in Copley's youth. And the only place that they would have imagined as a capital city was London, which they called home, with a capital H often in their manuscripts, even if they had never been there, which I think shows something of the condition of what it is to be provincial. Some of Copley's first paintings were seascapes, I think creatures of that oceanic circulation. This is a piece of Copley juvenilia called Galatea Rising from the Waves, which languishes in store in the MFA for very good reason. It was painted when Copley was 16, just sort of breaking into the world as an artist and an artisan. And I'll note a couple of things about it. One is it's very large. So it's twice the size of Revere, say, which means that for a poor old boy, young man, youth, as they would have called him in his time, he's taking a lot of material that he can ill afford to produce this image. It's also not the kind of genre that anybody would ever have bought in Britain's American colonies. People bought portraits and seascapes, and he has read enough art treatises by this time that he knows that allegory and classical scenes and history are the top of the ladder of European academic genres, and he's trying his hand at it. It's a faint echo of a European print. In the book, I trace the sort of layers of foundation from classical mythology to Roman new masters in the 15th and 16th century, to prints made of those in 16th and 17th century Northern Europe, which somehow wash up in Boston in bookshops or private collections where Copley can paint it. So it's sort of a game of visual telephone that he gets to know about this scene and this image and think that it's important to copy it. So here he is at 16, a young man of modest birth and rocky upbringing, painting himself still quite poorly into the seat of empire as a British artist, and trying to imagine a world in color from a world in black and white. So the oceanic world is one of the things I want you to remember about Copley's America, and the other is that it's a world of war, in which the war we call the American Revolution and he called Britain's American War is only one. So here are the wars of Copley's lifetime, a life of 77 years, of which 45 were spent with Britain at war, with his Britain at war. He was born in 1738 at the tail end, in the very final year of the longest period of peace that would prevail for a century. His earliest surviving works date to 1753 and 1754, which was, unbeknownst to him, the eve of the great global war that would come to be known as the 7 Years' War, though the fighting lasts for various places in 9 years. So a world of oceanic interconnection and a world of imperial war fought increasingly either in or over North American imperial territories. That world of war is important to Copley's story in a variety of ways, and the first of those ways is that it creates economic and artistic opportunity for him just at the time that he's looking for a way to make a living as the only male potential head of household after his father and stepfather have died. So the first time Copley's world bursts into color in the mid-1750s, the color is British imperial red. Between 1755 and 1760, he garnered a number of important commissions, important not in the sense of the art that they produced, but in their strategic value for him building a career. Important commissions from soldiers and statesmen who wanted, as this fellow, Major George Scott, did in this painting, to show themselves wrapped in the scarlet fabric of the empire. These paintings haven't gotten a lot of attention because they're formulaic, and many of them are quite pedestrian. But in the book, I put a lot of interpretive weight on the opportunity that the 7 Years' War provided to a young provincial British artist to break the frame of his local place, to break out of Boston. The strategies these paintings tested, the networks that they built for him, the skills that they allowed him to perfect, all became very important to Copley in the post-war world. The 7 Years' War, which we think of as historians of the American Revolution as being the beginning and the beginning of the end of empire, is in many ways the opposite. It's the place where the first British Empire really knits itself together as a nexus of disparate provinces increasingly governed from a strong central place. It's the war that made America, a famous book about the 7 Years' War claims. It's also the war that made John Singleton Copley. And he kept painting these military commissions through that war and substantially after the end of it. The most important of his North American painted redcoats is this 3/4 length portrait of General Thomas Gage, painted in 1768, within months, if not within weeks, of the portrait of Revere. So before we go imputing political meanings and motives to Copley's American portraits of the 1750s, we have to remember Revere and Gage in the same frame. Gage had come to Boston to settle an occupying army into its winter quarters in the fall of 1768. But this, too, is not the beginning of the American Revolution, and one of the ways that we see that, if we look at the evidence around Gage's visit, is how eager Bostonians, even Sons of Liberty, were to meet the most highly placed imperial official who had ever come to Boston, to dine with him, to toast him, to have the occasion of celebrity that Gage's visit provided. And part of that occasion of celebrity was sitting for this portrait by Copley. Copley kept painting redcoats after the 1760s. So the Gage Commission produced a network of connections that continued to be valuable, that took Copley to New York in 1771, where the list of people whose portraits he would paint also followed a sort of British military web out of the fort, Fort George in Lower Manhattan. So this is his portrait. This is his portrait of Captain John Montresor, a surveyor, painted in 1771, sort of captain to colonel to captain, following these commissions to build a network of powerful patronage and transoceanic connection. The network of sea captains and army captains and merchants that ferried Copley's work home to London beginning in 1765, and that would carry Copley himself there in 1774, followed this warp and weft of scarlet imperial broadcloth. This is the portrait of his half-brother, exhibition-style painting known now as Boy with a Flying Squirrel, that he sent to London in 1765 to sort of serve as a calling card and see if he could make it, how his work would hold up at home. He had been painting and planning this the entire year. He used this network of military connections to get the portrait to London and to people in the customs house and on the wharves who would hang it at the exhibition of the Society of Arts of Great Britain, which was itself kind of a 7 Years' War product for London itself. So this all comes out of those wartime connections, and I have made the case in the book that we ought even to see the red drape behind him as part of the sort of grand fabric of the empire that comes out of those red coats. In other words, the people of British America and even the people of Boston were for the redcoats until they were agin 'em. So I've painted Copley as a creature of happenstance and drift, but he did one thing extremely deliberately in his life that wound up having tremendous ramifications, not only personally, but politically, and I want to spend the next chunk of my talk talking about that decision, which was his choice of a bride in the fall of 1769, about a year after he painted Paul Revere and General Thomas Gage. Copley's marriage to Susanna Farnham Clarke was the most important decision of his life. She was the daughter of a wealthy Boston merchant. The great ornateness with which he depicts himself in this pastel marital portrait and the sort of rustic simplicity with which he depicts her in the pendant of the same year in some ways reverses their positions. She was the creature of silk and he was the creature of homespun. It's not insignificant characterologically that he's the peacock and she's the hen. We can come back to that. But he made this marriage very deliberately. We know he delayed marriage for a long time. He wrote about it. He was 31 when he got married, which is about 6 years past the demographic average. Social historians like me wonder, are people conscious of the demographic average? And he was, indeed. He talked in his letters about how hard it was to sort of husband himself for his career and to wait into his late 20s, and there would be years longer until he plighted his troth to Sukie Clarke. His distinctive family of origin, the fact that his father died when he was very young and that his stepfather died when he was only 13, meant that in Sukie's father, this sort of merchant patriarch, he got the only real male head of household that he ever had in his life. The marriage produced new kinds of independence for Copley and also new relationships of dependency that I want to talk about through his pictures. So the first thing he got with his marriage, besides the love of Sukie herself, and it was a very affectionate marriage from the letters, was he got a lot of property. He began building a Beacon Hill estate that was large enough, you can maybe make out on the inset there, that it was labeled as a map feature in this 1777 map as Copley's Hill. It was between 12 and 14 contiguous acres of Beacon Hill in Boston. I think the largest contiguous estate in downtown Boston. So this is, he goes from being an artisan son of a widowed mother living in a tobacco shop on the Long Wharf to being a kind of self-styled country grandee. He grows potatoes there. He's a gentleman farmer. It's a very elaborate performance of self, all of which comes with Sukie's marriage portion. He gets land. He gets children. Children born very regularly, with the first, Betsy, her birthday falling, I think, 9 months and 2 days after the marriage, and children at barely 18-month intervals after that. This is very close together for the period. Birth intervals are usually about 2.5 to 3 years. Social historians know that the reason this is so is that women nursed partly as a means of family design, but this family was elevated enough that they put their children out to wet nurse. So she got pregnant quickly and regularly, and he had 3 children by 1772. He seems at this point in 1772 or 1773 to be feathering this nest in Boston and planning to stay there. He imagined taking a painting trip to Europe, but put it off in 1773, I think probably because Sukie was pregnant again. So land and love and children. He also entered the world of slaveholders upon his marriage. And in this, he was not unlike other elites in Boston, whose growing sense of the importance of their liberty was threaded through with the institution of chattel slavery, that most American of contradictions, and ones that Britons who disagreed with the American anti-imperial strand had begun to mock, as Samuel Johnson, the poet Samuel Johnson, did so famously in 1775 when he wrote, "How is it that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes?" We know there were at least 3 bondspeople in Copley's household in the immediate wake of his marriage. A young boy called Snap, who probably came from the Caribbean, where Sukie's father had business. A girl called Lucy, who we know about because Copley sold her in 1771 into the Pepperell family, who were among the largest slaveholders in Boston, and an older boy or young man called Cato, after the classical naming fashion of enslaved people, a sort of high-low mockery, right, to call enslaved people by classical names. We know about Cato because Cato married in Boston after the Revolution and left a record that way where he's called Mr. Copley's Cato. I don't know who this man was, but he was clearly known intimately to Copley in 1778. It's a very familiar kind of picture. It's one of only, I can't remember whether it's 3 or 4 pictures in which Copley depicts teeth, a gesture of polite condescension and intimacy, and all the others are Copley's children. This is a study picture that you may recognize as the apex figure in the painting Watson and the Shark. The study picture stays in the Copley family until the mid-1860s, when it's sold to the United States. It's in Detroit now. It's known in the Copley family as head of a favorite Negro. So I don't know whether he retained black servants in London. They would have been free in London by British law, but this kind of interdependence of slavery and liberty comes to him with marriage. Marriage also provoked Copley to take, for the first time, a trip abroad, which is what he called it when he went to New York in 1771. So New York is abroad and London is home. Among the 36 paintings he churned out there in a breakneck 6 months was this spectacular likeness of Margaret Campbell Gage, the general's wife, which he called the greatest female portrait he had ever made at that time. It's in San Diego in the tiny Timken Museum. It is worth the trip to see in person. So he gets love and children and land and slaves and property and travel and tea. Copley's father sold many things. One of them was tea. He went in and out of the tea business as the commodity was protested at various points in the late 1760s and early 1770s. But by 1772 or 1773, he was back at it, making a handsome profit as one of the few Boston merchants to willingly and openly sell this addictive soft drug in a market where people increasingly shied away from it. In the summer of 1773, after Parliament passed the Tea Act, it began to give licenses to some North American firms to sell East India Company tea directly into the provincial American market for the first time. And Copley's father-in-law sent one of his sons, sent Copley's brother-in-law, Jonathan, to London to sort of wait outside India House, as the East India Company's residence was called, and hope to be one of the lucky people who got one of these tea licenses for Boston. And the good bad luck is that he succeeded. So that when, in the late summer and fall of 1773, 4 tea ships sailed toward Boston, providing a wonderful opportunity to the Liberty men who had been organizing there to strike what they thought would be a daring and, as John Adams put it in his diary, a sublime blow for their cause. The plurality of the tea, I think it's 100 plus of the 347 chests that were dumped into the harbor, belonged to Copley's father-in-law. American historians quote often the passage that John Adams wrote in his diary about what came in the 19th century to be called the Boston Tea Party. This is the most magnificent movement of all. There is a dignity, a majesty, a sublimity of this last effort of the Patriots that I greatly admire. The destruction of the tea, that's what it was called at the time, is so daring, so bold, so firm and intrepid that it must have important consequences. Et cetera, et cetera. We rarely quote the very next line in Adams's diary, in which he says, "Many persons wish that as many dead carcasses were floating in the harbor as there are chests of tea." And he went on to name not Copley's father-in-law by name, but the categories of persons whose carcasses we wished were floating face down, including the customs officers and the tea consignees. So after December of 1773, Copley lived in a place increasingly descending into civil war, in which his marital kin were on the wrong side. They were exiles, both protected and imprisoned in the British fort in the island for their own safety, threatened with mobbing, tarring and feathering, and worse if ever they showed their faces in proper Boston again. So that after this Tea Party moment, Copley's marriage remained the most important decision of his life, but in a very different way than he had anticipated, so that he wound up marrying his citizenship. For all of these reasons, for family and war and calling and empire and only a smattering of political ideals, Copley's revolution led him home to the place where the family portrait sat on the easel in the spring of 1776, while some of his Boston neighbors, including men like Sam Adams and John Hancock, whom he had painted and grown to despise, had begun drafting a document declaring the independence of a nation and a new idea of America that Copley would never share or even see. I'll just allude to the London half of his life here, where he lived and read and saw and thought about the American Revolution as Britain's American war, a no choices left war, and very soon a losing war. It's one of the great ironies of the career of this American exile artist that the American War remained his context and his calling card for much of the rest of his life. It started out as a great boon to him as a public subject and became a kind of millstone by the late 1780s and early 1790s. His public pictures in London were in many ways the art of winning by painting losing. In London, he was able to paint as he could not possibly have done in British America or the new United States, these large, busy, complex, vivid pictures, public art that demanded public patronage. The dilemma was how to paint a war that nobody wanted to heroic effect, to an effect where people would come out to see it. It's almost the dilemma of the memorial of the Vietnam War from the perspective of Britain in the 1770s. And the American Revolution threads through all of his big London successes. Watson and the Shark in 1778, the death of the Earl of Chatham in 1781, and a very belated painting, The Siege and Relief of Gibraltar, 10 years after that. I'm only going to show you one of these today, which is the third and I think the greatest of Copley's great American War paintings, The Death of Major Pearson, which celebrates a battle and even a theater of the Revolution that you may never have considered. This is the Battle of Jersey, not New Jersey, but the Isle of Jersey in the English Channel. The battle, such as it was, took place in January of 1781. It featured no North American combatants, and that's an important feature of Copley's American War pictures. They don't damn the Americans, but they do celebrate the British. You see the British flag. In fact, this battle featured no official enemies at all. It was a skirmish between a group of French legionnaires out raiding and a British garrison that defended itself quite poorly, but ultimately successful in an engagement that lasted 15 minutes. It was so inglorious that the governor of the Isle of Jersey was court-martialed for his dereliction in allowing these boats of Frenchmen to land. The gallant young Major Francis Pearson, who died at 21, was somebody that nobody had ever heard of. So this is unlike Benjamin West's The Death of General Wolfe, where Wolfe was an iconic national figure by the time West paints them. So this is a minor major, so to speak. So one of Copley's greatest paintings celebrates this battle that wasn't exactly a battle, the heroism of someone who no one had ever heard of in a theater of war that didn't matter, in a war that Britain was losing badly by the time he began the project and had lost by the time it was exhibited in 1784. Really the art of losing ground to snatch a glorious painting from the jaws of that little sliver of victory. There are a couple of striking passages in the painting, which is at Tate Britain. One of them is this figure of African descent in the middle, shown firing his gun to avenge Pearson's death. He is in servant's livery and not in military dress, which is one of the ways that he gets to be a black man firing a gun in 1784. He's not in the chain of command. I and a graduate student I was working with discovered who he was. This is a man who was born enslaved in the Carolinas, who attached himself not to Major Pearson, as he's shown doing in Copley's painting, but to a Captain James Christie, and who followed Christie out of slavery in the Carolinas, first to British-held New York, and eventually to Jersey. Christie goes on to build his military career at the most important theater of the American War, which was, of course, Jamaica, not Valley Forge. This man, who is either Alec or Burton, stays behind in London. I think he's a figure, and there are several of them in Copley's American War paintings, that incarnates British liberty. This is Samuel Johnson's point, right? America may be winning freedom, but Britain still stands for liberty. And it was indeed the enslaved man's, and sometimes the enslaved family's, best choice to throw in with the empire. The other really anomalous passage in this painting and in battle painting is the fleeing family that you see at the front left of the field, this group of women and children throwing their hands up in horror, who are Copley's wife and baby, his son and namesake there in the little suit, and we don't know who stands in for the maidservant behind them. shown in flight and in exile as they were in many ways in life. So I'll close by thinking about a question that haunted Copley when he heard about the war, which was how well or poorly we see the future. How short a way do we penetrate into the secrets of futurity, as he puts it in his 18th century idiom. I think one of the things a close view of Copley's world through Copley's eyes reveals is the difference that it makes to see history forward rather than backward. I think this is especially true in the world of the American Revolution, which has come to seem, in retrospect, to those of us in the United States, so tidy and foreordained, almost a kind of destiny, right, a national destiny. So Copley, like the rest of us, saw the future both well and poorly. For example, he was confident from the time he wrote this letter in August of 1775 that the Americans would win, an opinion that he shared with almost exactly nobody. If you read George Washington's letters in the summer of 1775, after he has taken command of the new ragtag, starving Continental Army, he certainly doesn't think the Americans win. But Copley does, because he has seen how intransigent the people of Boston are. He knows that they will not back down. He doesn't think this is a good thing. He thinks that the country, as he says, will be torn in pieces twice. This is quoting him, first by the quarrel with Great Britain till it is a distinct government, and then with civil discord till time has settled it into some permanent form. Whether that form, he said, would be free or despotic is beyond the reach of human wisdom to decide, and I'm not sure we have an answer yet. As an artist, he sensed the future poorly, in that he hung on to the American war long after the eyes of Britain had turned to the next great imperial war in France. So he's painting the siege and relief of Gibraltar, one of Britain's narrow and important victories at the end of the Revolution or the American War, at the same time that what the London market is clamoring for is this little fella, Napoleon. This goes up in 1791, 15 years after the events that eventually culminated in the relief of this siege. He missed the moment artistically of the Second Imperial War, and his last 2 decades at least are a story of decline, of the failure to sense either the possibilities of citizenship in the United States or to seize fully the joy of being a subject in the British Empire. He was a poor subject and an unwilling citizen. The realm in which he best grasped and most fully made his future was the realm in which he said was most important to him, his own family. He said during his grand tour that the whole purpose of his artistic ambition and vision was to bring his children into the great world with reputation. And it's one of the commitments of my book and my work as somebody who started as a woman's historian and now often works on men, to take cues like that seriously. If he says his life was all about family, I'm interested in how far we can go in believing him. So if his artistic strategy was a family strategy, he succeeded beyond his wildest expectations. His surviving son, John Singleton Copley Jr., became Baron Lyndhurst, Lord High Chancellor, and a peer of the new creation. And this is his state portrait painted by Thomas Phillips in the 1730s. He visited the United States in 1796 in a kind of reverse grand tour, writing home to his parents about whether it was safe for the women and children. He writes a letter to his father when he says, if you want to test your Republican sympathies, you ought to see Philadelphia. He does not mean this kindly. His daughter, Betsy, the figure, that staring figure at the center of the family portrait, also succeeded, though somewhat more darkly. In 1800, at the ripe age of 30, she married back to America, but not to Copley's America or the America of her birth, but this new United States. Like her father, she also married into a fortune built in slavery. In her case, more directly, she married a Demerara sugar planter named Gardner Greene. They lived on Beacon Hill in grand style. Their wealth saved the artist in his declining years and fueled the son's rise into British state power. They had a large staff of servants, including several free African Americans and at least one slave named Harry, who was also Gardner Greene's son. When Greene died in 1832, he freed Harry in his will, which means that Harry Copley Greene was one of the last, if not the last, enslaved man in Boston, and Betsy Copley Greene, one of the last slaveholders. Betsy survived a very long time. All the children who survived childhood lived into their 90s. This is a studio portrait taken in 1862, not a real parrot, during what she called a civil war. What she called a revolution. So the children call the American Civil War a revolution, as they call what we call the American Revolution a civil war. And I close with her because it was her perspicacity that brought many of the paintings that we consider Copley's revolutionary American treasures back to the United States. Boy with a Flying Squirrel, The Ascensions, The Izzards, Watson and the Shark, that Black Man's Head, and so on and so on. These works hang here in our American wings, and we like to think of their journey back to Boston as a return, but it wasn't really. It was a journey to a new nation they had never been. Copley's America was long gone. I told you I would circle back to this picture in the end. It hangs today in the American National Gallery in Washington, D.C., appropriately surrounded by the works of Joshua Reynolds and George Romney and other peers of Copley who were British from cradle to grave. Thank you.